In 1 Corinthians 11, we accepted Paul's challenge to judge for yourselves what is proper in our cultural context. We noticed that Paul encouraged propriety in worship for both men and women, that there should be enough order and decorum that our dress and behavior do not become a distraction to the gospel. And in 1 Corinthians 14:35, he writes, "The women are to keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but are to subject themselves, just as the law also says. If they desire to learn anything, let them ask their own husbands at home, for it is improper for a woman to speak in church." Now this seems very clear. The women are to keep silent, except that we've already established that they were not expected to always be silent, because sometimes they were expected to pray or prophesy. So this cannot be a definitive prohibition, but rather a more conditional or limited guidance. So if women were not always to be silent, then when were they supposed to be silent? Well, Paul answers that question in the next verse. They are to be silent when learning. This is a conditional silencing. They're to be silent when learning. It's actually one of 3 conditional silencings that occurs in this chapter. Verse 27, "If anyone speaks in a tongue, it should be by 2, or at the most 3, and each in turn, and one must interpret. But if there is no interpreter, he must keep silent in the church." One who spoke in tongues was permitted to speak at some times, but was asked to keep silent if 3 others had already gone, and to keep silent if there wasn't an interpreter available. This was a conditional silencing, and it seems to apply to both men and women. Verse 29, "Let 2 or 3 prophets speak, and let the others pass judgment. But if a revelation is made to another who is seated, the first one must keep silent." This again is a conditional silencing of men and women. It was actually a more active silencing because it required someone who was already speaking to yield the floor to a new revelation. So I guess we need to acknowledge that 1st century church in Corinth is practically quite different from 21st century church in San Antonio. In Corinth, there wasn't a salaried preacher who delivered a 4-point sermon from established scripture. The Christian Bible was still being written, circulated, and copied down. So they had to rely on the Hebrew Bible for authority, and they supplemented that with news of current events and letters from other churches and messages from various leaders and direct revelation from God, who spoke through interpreted tongues and direct prophecy. Then, using this source material, the congregants would pass judgment on the prophecies, meaning that they would question it, examine the testimony, see how it fit in with established doctrine, and that required the learned men of the group to process the information in open debate. Now, I say the learned men because you may remember that ancient Jewish women were mostly forbidden from any significant religious education. Women learned household chores, but they were not taught how to read or not allowed to discuss the Torah or listen to the rabbi's teaching. Now, the Gentile women of Corinth may have had more access to education in general, but they were even less knowledgeable regarding Judeo-Christian history. Jesus liberated women's education in the 1st century. But these newly liberated women didn't have all the background knowledge of the men who had been studying the Torah and were now trying to apply the Hebrew scriptures to their new Messiah. So now the women have to catch up. And every time they stop the conversation to ask a question, they are seriously slowing down the whole process of the assembly teaching. Paul might be saying, ask the questions at home. Let your husband teach you the basics there. When the men are trying to interpret Daniel and you don't know Daniel, and so we try to explain who Daniel is, but you don't know the history of the exile, and so you stop to ask, what does this mean, or how is this connected to that? You're really slowing us down. I don't think Paul is being sexist. I think he's being pragmatic. Let the educated speak in the assembly, and then let them explain it at home. And again, let's not gloss over the fact that women are finally being taught, even if it's mostly at home. That's a huge step. And as we mentioned, this silencing of women seems to be conditional or limited. So once the women get caught up, then let them join in the discussion, but then they will be propelling the conversation forward, not slowing it down. Once the women are well learned, then let them teach and pass judgment, just like they've already been praying, serving, and prophesying. I think the principle here is to learn before you speak. Ask your questions at home and in small groups and around the dinner table, over coffee with a friend. Grow in knowledge, and then you can talk and ask intelligent questions in the assembly. Again, the way first century Corinth did church was pretty different from the way we do church. We don't allow just anyone to grab the microphone and begin prophesying. Our customs have changed. I don't think we should recreate Corinthian tradition regarding the order of church services, and I don't think we were intended to recreate their rules regarding uneducated women, since most of our women are properly educated. However, I do think we should apply the same principle of learning before speaking. So we cannot pull out these specific recommendations from their cultural context, which was conditional. We shouldn't try to apply them generally in perpetuity. To take this as an unconditional prohibition on women speaking is not only antithetical to Paul's intention, but it disregards the forward progress of the gospel message toward an increasing role of women. Peter spoke of Joel's prophecy in Acts 2. And it shall be in the last days, God says, that I will pour forth of my Spirit on all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young shall see visions, and your old shall dream dreams. Even on my bondslaves, both men and women, I will in those days pour forth of my Spirit, and they shall prophesy. Sons and daughters, men and women. Sounds nice, doesn't it? Seems more complete. Seems right. Till next time.